Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. We're so glad you're tuning into this episode, and I'm excited to introduce to you Greg Farrand. And I actually heard Greg being interviewed on another podcast called Homebrewed Christianity with Trip Fuller. And I loved just what Greg was about. I loved hearing his story. So I thought, man, I'm going to try to hunt him down and see if I can get him on Spirituality Adventures. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
He's been the executive director of Second Breath, and we're going to talk about that. But just recently is in a transition, and we'll let you catch us up on that as well. But let's first just dive into your background story. I always like to get a little origin story, kind of orient us to where you were born, where you grew up, sort of your spiritual journey. Yep. Give us a little overview.
All right. Well, I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. But before I was one, we moved to Japan. And my mother and father worked for the National Security Agency. I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was government, but we were in the National Security Agency. We moved to Japan. We were there until I was 5, moved back to the States for a year or two, then moved to Taiwan, where we were posted again. And this was not military life. We're off base and just living in the countryside. That was outside of Taipei. And I was there right up until 6th grade when I came back to the States, and we moved back to Maryland, which Fort Meade is the NSA headquarters. So we were somewhat near there and also very close to the DC area, Bethesda, those kind of areas, the suburbs of right outside of DC. So then 6th or 12th grade, I was in that area. My parents, when the little brief time we moved back from Japan, they were curious. My mother grew up Reorganized Latter-day Saints, which is Mormonism, and she let go of that. Her father was one of the leading patriarchs in the country,
really,
which was fascinating.
So the headquarters is here in Kansas City, or Independence.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's right here in Kansas City. Who's that? Because I know some of. I actually know a few of those.
And it might be one of the. Okay, so she's very fastidious about this, and she's told me so many times. But when the founder died, there was some followed Brigham Young,
right,
and they became the Mormons, and another followed his son,
right,
and that became the group that my mother's family was a part of, and their mainstay was in Iowa.
Oh, okay.
And so his name was Roy Cheville. He wrote a bunch of books, and really interesting guy. But she really wanted nothing to do with that.
They recently went through a pretty big morphing of their theology and renamed themselves Community of Christ, and actually are a bit more into the process theology world which
is fascinating to some degree. Yeah, some degree that how it gels with the Book of Mormon, from my understanding. But yes, it is fascinating. Interesting.
Well, anyway, keep rolling.
Oh, so my dad kind of grew up as an atheist in Long Island. My mother grew up in Iowa. They met, and but it was not a large spiritual tradition. But they came back and fell in love with the Episcopal Church of all places. And I think it was very open, accepting. They loved kind of the ancient liturgy. And I had, I was forced to go. I even was an acolyte, which is the, part of the carrying down the cross or carrying down the torches, sitting up there on the altar in the front. But I thought, I wanted nothing to do with it. And we came back, and fortunately, I started deteriorating pretty quickly, coming back in the 6th grade, having grown up overseas. But I was an American, but I never really lived in America, so I didn't understand the culture or the rules. I remember, in Taiwan, where I've been living, was about 10 years behind the trends of what was happening in the States, because this is way before the internet, right? This is back in like the late 70s, early 80s. And so I remember my first day of sixth grade, I was so excited, but I was wearing, this was the day, and you'll remember this because we're near our Venn overlap of age is pretty significant. But I was still wearing like the short OP shorts and the wristbands and like the tube socks with the colors on the top. And I was still taking a bath like twice a week, and I just roll out with my bed head. And I remember that, and I thought I was on fire, man. I was like, I had my wristband, I had my socks pulled up, and then I get on the bus, and it was like the first day of sixth grade. I get on the bus and everybody goes quiet. Like maybe I was the new kid, but everyone went quiet as soon as I got on the bus, and they were all wearing like corduroy pants and Izod button ups, and they gelled hair. And one kid, Jeremy, from the back of the bus yells out, "What's wrong with your hair?" And everybody started laughing at me. That was my introduction to American culture with my peers. And I remember I was mortified. I went home. I told my mom, "We've got to go to the mall. I need new clothes." And then it was a quest to try to fit in, and always feeling like pretty good at chameleoning on the outside, but inside feeling really disconnected. And I would say that was a significant, it started clearly with the experience at that age, but it really defined a lot of my trajectory. And now I view it as a superpower, but then it was like kryptonite, man. It slaughtered me at that age. So anyway, that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Yeah. So, help us with your spiritual journey. How did you, because I know you ended up becoming a fairly conservative, Reformed theology. Oh, yeah. Okay, so get us from
hardcore. I was a 5-pointer,
man. School, misfit to,
Yeah. So it was. I was back in the DC area for middle school, and then I think my parents could sense that I wasn't doing well. Like in middle school, like the popular kids. And this is way back in the day when it was cliques, back nowadays, my kids in school, it's like way more accepting, but back then there's like jocks, theater geeks, and it was all categorized. And like I felt like an outsider, but the popular kids let me hang out with them, but kind of like a jester, they would I was like a punching bag almost, like I felt like that little tiny chihuahua running around the bulldog, in all the old cartoons, like just yipping and getting attention. And I think my parents saw that I was not doing well. So they had the wisdom to send me, instead of the massive public school in DC, Walt Whitman, they sent me to this Episcopal prep school, which I'm grateful for. And then I was not excited about it, but I'm grateful because it was a smaller, safer environment where I could only get in so much trouble. And I was probably the worst element there, because I was kind of the kid that would be drawn to the worst element, or they were drawn to me. And it was helpful that I was kind of the worst element there, because I couldn't get much lower. And I was good at trying to figure out what was accepted. I was playing lacrosse. My grades were okay. I had the pretty girlfriend, but inside I just felt like more and more just pain, anxiety. I was kind of Epicurean in the sense that anything I wanted to do, I would do it. If it was a drug, I would try it. If it was hooking up with as many girls as I could, I'd try it. And it was trying all these stupid things that and I was a really angry drunk. I was a tiny kid. When I was entering the 9th grade, I was 4'11" and weighed less than 100 pounds. So I hadn't hit puberty yet. And I was like this little mouthy kid that learned to, be really harsh with my words as kind of some self-protection. I grew a foot that year, but still it was kind of the die was cast. And so there was all this kind of inward sense of not fitting in, not belonging. I think a lot of it was I didn't have, now that I've studied a lot more of this stuff, I never really had a secure attachment, my family system in many ways, moving around. I think by the time I was 12, we'd already moved something like 12 times. And so never really having that root structure. And then I started just trying to numb the pain. And so at that point it was getting more and more into intense drugs, but simultaneously trying to maintain this facade of togetherness. And I remember it reached a boiling point when I was 17. It was January 3rd of 1990. I remember the day, January 3rd of 1990. We had a lacrosse party. And I remember I went into a room to hook up with my girlfriend. And I remember I had like zero desire to be intimate with her. And I'm just like, I'm 17. I'm supposed to have hormones through the roof. And I was just like, I know even this will not bring me any happiness or life. Like even this is bullshit. And it was a place where I remember thinking, I just started crying. And my girlfriend's like, what is going on with you? And I'm like, whatever. And I just walked out of the room and I went up to the keg and I put the keg tap in my mouth and I just turned it on. And I just laid next to the keg tap, just drinking it like as quick as I could drink it or breathe. I was just laying there and I was just trying to check out. And my buddy kind of picked me up off the floor and graciously drove me home. That was a Saturday night. That Sunday, February 4th, I spent the day trying to figure out how I was going to end my life. Because I just thought, I didn't know Sartre at the time, but Sartre, who said, man is a useless passion, that pretty much that we were living in this world without no meaning. We have all these longings and passions and there's nothing that can scratch the itch. And I'm like, if I'm 17 and I'm already at this point where I'm so miserable, I cannot continue this for another 50, 60, 70 years. What's the point?
Yeah.
And so I spent Sunday trying to figure out ways that I was going to commit suicide. And that Monday morning, a buddy of mine, Kevin, and Kevin was actually the one that drove me home. Kevin would often volunteer to be my designated driver. And I was like, great, man, one less thing for me to worry about. He'd just drive me around when I just get hammered. And when I was hammered, we'd have these great conversations. He was a big kind of into philosophy and reading, and I was into Nietzsche and he was into Kierkegaard. So we get into all these, what we thought were brilliant debates. I'm sure that they were level one, silliness, but at the time we thought we were geniuses. But he was a Christian. And I didn't even know what that was. I mean, this is DC, and it's not like down south where it's the Bible Belt and people are telling you to come to Jesus. He was just this really kind guy. And even when I tried to fight him, and I was, he would look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was an all-star defenseman on a lacrosse team. He was ripped, huge. And even when I tried to fight him and he could have squashed me, he was always kind to me on Monday morning. Like everyone else would be furious with me because I tried to fight and I was such a angry drunk. But he was always kind on Monday. And so he really earned this respect. I really respected this kid. And I go into school on Monday morning. This is February 5th of 1990. And he walks up and he says, Greg, I just want you to know I've been praying for you. And I'd never heard that. Like no one, I mean, again, this is not the South where they say that every meal, right? But this is like, I'd never heard that. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, I just want you to know I've been praying for you. And it because of how kind and loving he had been towards me for a long time, like it really landed. I was like, dude, I don't even know what that means, but the fact, and I don't believe in God, but that your intention towards me is kind, and that what you want, what is good for me, and you're talking to your imaginary unicorn deity about me. I thank you. And I remember right then we went and sat down, and he said, well, where kind of you with your beliefs? And I said, honestly, man, I'm at a point where it feels like there's a dark cloud above my head, like a roiling, boiling dark cloud as far as the eye can see. And I feel oppressed. I feel depressed. I feel anxious. And I didn't tell him I was contemplating committing suicide, but and then he started sharing with me what he believed, and not in any kind of 4 spiritual laws. Let me try to convert you. I've got an agenda to get you in. But he was just sharing with me genuinely what he believed. And I honestly don't even remember the specifics of what he said. But experientially, all I knew is that one moment I did not believe in God. I thought God was a crutch for the weak. Clearly I was doing so well with my philosophy, but I thought God was a crutch for the weak. And one moment I didn't believe in God, and the next, like existentially, ontologically, experientially within my being, I knew that there was a God that existed and loved me. And in that moment, I described it to my friend Kevin. I was like, it was like a corner of that dark roiling cloud got lifted, and I saw this drop of blue sky. That was so beautiful. I realized like every drug I'd taken, every, hookup, every crazy thing I did to try to fulfill myself that never filled me up. Like that was the source, this blue sky, this divine mystery, like that's the source of everything. So I just went full bore, and that's kind of my personality. I went 110 miles. I remember I marched up to all my friends. I was like, dudes, I'm not doing any more drugs because that's hampering this And I didn't call it, it was not Jesus or Buddha. I didn't know yet. I mean, my estimation and my perception, I just knew that it was in this divine mystery. And this was the source of it. I went to my girlfriend and said, we're not having sex anymore. And it was almost this reactive place of, these are the things that I look to for life that in fact hampered me and hindered me. All I want to do now with my life is explore this drop of blue sky, this divine mystery, and invite others into that same dance. And pretty much at 17, that's defined the entire trajectory of my life all the way to 51. I mean, it was and there's a lot of evolution and roller coastering through all sorts of theological traditions since then. But that was something that really changed everything for me when I was 17.
Interesting. Wow. So it's kind of interesting because it wasn't like a classic, maybe evangelical, like
right.
I literally, was doing drugs and walked an aisle at a Southern Baptist youth camp.
Yeah, baby.
And cried and gave my life to Jesus. So, and it changed me too. 2 months later, I felt called to be a pastor, and it changed the trajectory of my life for sure. But interesting. So one of the things that intrigued me about your story was you ended up getting into Reformed theology. I kind of want you to take us from your Reformed theology, maybe give us a view into that, but then how you've described that as like a super intellectual, Western Aristotelian mind space type of religious experience, and then what drew you into what you talk about now so much as an embodied spirituality? Help, because some people might sound like weird outer space talk for
some woo. No, I get it.
Help us with that journey from sort of the diving into the intellectual theological headspace to kind of where your spirituality is at. Take us through that.
Absolutely.
That journey and transition.
So that happened, that kind of awakening happened when I was 17. So I was just about to graduate high school. And then I moved down to North Carolina for college, into the Bible Belt. And so before I left, like, Kevin was a Christian, so I was intrigued by his Christianity. And so I started going to his church, some with him. But I was still like, I didn't know if I was going to be a Buddhist. I didn't know if I was going to be a Christian. But at the same time, I was still so emotionally fragile. Like, all this stuff that had led up to that, in my life, all that sense of lack of attachment, lack of security, insecurity, lack of identity. Like, so I needed a faith that was pretty binary and simple. And what I mean by that is I didn't like mystery. Mystery was to be tolerated, but not celebrated. And so where I was at that point was, okay, so here's the good news. Jesus died for me. My sins are forgiven. I'm going to heaven. The world's going to hell in a handbasket, and our main job is to get other people to go to heaven with us. So it was super clear. It wasn't complex. So I was on campus at UNC Greensboro, down on the main drag, Tate Street, constantly evangelizing and witnessing, trying to get people to pray the prayer with me. Like, I was passionate about it, and I just thought it was really simple, but it was really stressful. I was terrified that I was gripping onto God. And I was terrified that if I let go of this passionate grip, I was going to fall back into that place of darkness where I wanted to kill myself. So I'd get up and have like 3-hour quiet times, like just about every morning on the golf course, like just reading my Bible and writing prayer. I mean, I was just like so intense about it, but it was so anxiety producing because it was kind of existential dread that if I lose this, I'm a goner. And around that time, someone gave me, this is such a weird book to give someone, but someone gave me a copy of Martin Luther's Sermons on Galatians. And so
you're like 18 or 19.
Yeah, I was like 18. I was 18, but someone, and I'm not sure why they did. I can't even remember who gave it to me, but and then they also gave me his sermons on Romans, his argument on Romans and his argument on Galatians. And he started talking about passive grace, that it was not earned, but in the same way that the earth receives the rain effortlessly. We receive this grace from God. And while we might be afraid of slipping out of God's hands, that God's hands are so big, we're never going to slip out of God's hands. It was kind of this next step in my spiritual evolution of realizing that it wasn't about me gripping on, but me being, allowing, me resting. And I didn't know at that time, but it reminds me, if you look at almost all of Jesus' imperatives, they're all about do not be afraid. It's all these do nots of letting go of things. It's very little do's. All his imperatives are stop doing things and just be. And it was so this beginning invitation of beginning to rest. And so I was like, well, who's this Martin Luther guy? And I didn't really know much about him at the time, except for, the nailing the thesis on the door, but I got into Martin Luther, which then led me to Calvin, John Calvin, which then led me to Reformed Church, PCA, which was a pretty big church. And I went to a retreat where the pastor speaking was PCA. And what I loved about it was like, it still maintained like that secure, simple root structure of, that believe in Jesus, your sins are forgiven, you're going to heaven. But it was like, it had lots of intellectual territory. And I loved reading and I loved thinking. And so it was kind of like I'd been living in this tiny little neighborhood. And I realized it was this whole city of like the neighborhood was still my secure little center, but I got to read all of these Reformed theologians. And part of it too was this group really loved me and accepted me. Like they were so, here I was 19, and was reading the same thing as all these 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds and having these intensive conversations. So they loved this young, passionate, Reformed nerd that was so driven to learn. And so I really dove headlong into that. And during that time too, this same pastor was a part of a missions board and encouraged me to go overseas with this PCA mission. And so I ended up going to Uganda as a college student. And then after I graduated, I went back as a missionary for a couple of years in this Reformed church. And then when I came back from that,
what city were you in Uganda, or which town?
Right. It was called Bundabugyo, which is on the western, like we're 4 miles from the border of the Zaire, Congo.
Okay.
And so it's really like in the way that people talk about West Virginia, in the States, it was kind of the way, if you're in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, they talk about Bundabugyo, like honestly, it's just recently when we were there was no electricity, no running water, nothing. Yeah. Now, this time later, everyone there has a cell phone, a smartphone, but it was a completely different kettle of fish back in the early 90s, mid 90s. So anyway, very quickly. Yeah, now it's back there. So I came back, that pastor who's part of the board and invited me to his PCA church. They gave me a house. They gave me a job as campus minister. They paid for my seminary. So it was kind of like this welcoming coming back from overseas. And it was such a place of belonging and financial security and need security that I just, really splashed around in the PCA. And I graduated from Reformed Theological Seminary. I started in 97. It took me 5 years because I was working full time and starting to have kids. Finished up. And then they sent me to plant a church in Greensboro, North Carolina, which I started in 2001.
Awesome. All right. And how long did you pastor that church?
So I pastored that about 9 years. We started out with like 10 people in the living room, and it grew to a few hundred people, which I know if Kansas City, bigger churches, I've got some friends in the Northeast and out West. The idea of having a church of over 100 is like a miracle. But down here in the Bible Belt, that's a little more, average. Yeah. And so I pastored there for about 9 years, but I really started burning out when I was pastoring there. And like I could write this. I literally had written like dissertations on the love of God, on the grace of God. Earlier on, I was, very much into, I was a 5-point Calvinist. I've read it all. I read the footnotes. Like I could defend it. But I found when I was in the actual trenches of ministry and in these people's lives, so much of what I'd intellectualized when you hear, it was almost just like, if you could articulate the gospel clearly enough and biblically enough, then lives will change. If they get this information right, then their lives will change. And what I just found over and over again is that this intellectual, especially Western approach to spirituality, when we just hear this correct theology that's biblical, that we anticipate there's going to be real change. And it's just not true. That intellect alone will never change anyone. That I know most people can write dissertations on their issues, their parent issues, why they are the way they are, and there's not a single whit of change in their life because information alone will never change us. And so it was really disconcerting. I just kept thinking, here I'm preaching and we've got all these people come in and, they're from such different walks of life and people might get emotionally stirred and people might have a mountaintop experience and there might be some shifts, gentle shifts here and there. But in terms of this change that Jesus embodied and talked about of the fruit of the Spirit actually truly defining your inner landscape and your life being transformed, and I just didn't see it. I didn't see it in myself. I didn't see it in others. And so it really got me wrestling with this intellectualized approach to spirituality and beginning to question. And because I like to read, then it was just like, whoa, okay. We all have our paradigms. We all have the lens through which we view things. We all have our fish tanks, and it's hard to think outside of your existing fish tank, right? Because it's just the way things are. But then new things begin to challenge it and bump up against it. And so I kind of poked my head out of my little PCA fish tank, and I started looking around and thinking, there's so much more to this. I mean, Christendom globally. I mean, just with all these different traditions and approaches, whether it's the Vineyard movement and what they're emphasizing, or the PCA with the intellectualized. And I went through a very charismatic phase. I mean, I made sure I could speak in tongues. I could pray. I could just do. Right. I mean, I went to the holy laughter. I mean, I just was all about the experience of everything, all the things.
Right.
And but
there is a little bit of an embodiment in the charismatic Pentecostal tradition, a little, and it kind of borders on mysticism a little bit.
Yes. I would say in most of the traditions, in most Western traditions, it's not there. It's fascinating when you trace the root structure back of those movements, it's a fascinating kind of evolution. And, even back to the Great Awakening, when Jonathan Edwards was preaching and George Whitefield, they would have these, where people would start barking like dogs and doing all these wild things.
Yeah, the religious affections that they...
Right. And he wrote that to say, how do we know people have authentic transformation and conversion? He said, these are the things that define authentic conversion, not these special experiences. But he was saying, this is how you know it really landed. He wrote the religious affections to prove what really mattered, not just the mountaintop experience. So it's been around for a while, but I would agree with you that in terms of the different traditions, especially within the large evangelical umbrella, the Vineyards and Charismatics, while they always have, your own weaknesses to your strengths, I would say there is an embodiment there. And also I would say a acknowledgement and appreciation of joy as a part of what it means to be spiritually alive that is lacking in a lot of the other traditions.
Yeah. We weren't the frozen chosen, but
no. But we were. That was me, baby. That was me. I was the frozen chosen.
It's interesting, because I've always had a nerdy intellectual side, so I've always been getting degrees and just still love that. And I'm still learning and growing, but I've been through the Southern Baptist and then the Vineyard but still had a lot of anxiety, and which led to my 30 years of insomnia, which then led me eventually to try to treat my insomnia with I was a couple of years, 2.5 years on Xanax and alcohol every night to try to sleep, and wound up in rehab. And one of the, AA 12-step world, recovery world has all these statements. And one of them for me was, because I always had a lot of confidence in my ability to think my way through things and study, read and study and get degrees and then teach and preach and all that. And one of the phrases was, your best thinking got you here. You're sitting in a rehab, a bunch of drunks and alcoholics and addicts, and your best thinking got here. I was like, you son of a bitch.
Oh my God. Right.
I thought I could think my way out of anything, anyway.
Yeah. I remember that there was a moment in marriage counseling probably 20 years ago where, I felt kind of like, I didn't. I was an intellectual snob. I hope genuinely I'm not anymore. I'm 51, so I've gotten my ass handed to me enough. But at the time, I was like, I don't want to go to a therapist who's not smarter than me. Like, right? I was just like, they need to be smarter than me. And so I would go and test them out. And I was good at self-diagnosis. So they would ask a question, I'd figure out where they were going. I'd give the summary of my issues. I'd give the summary of self-diagnosis, and that kind of thing. And we were on the third session. And I was in the middle of what I thought was a very eloquent self-diagnostic soliloquy. And she says, let me stop you right there, Greg. And I was like, she says, you're very good at diagnosing yourself. And I was like, well, thank you. You said it, not me. She said, but you're very good at diagnosing yourself, but I see no change in your life. Mm. And it was one of these things. It was one of those moments where, like, yeah, my thinking had gotten me here, that I could write dissertations on all these issues, but it did not lead to authentic change. And I put so much trust in my intellect as the primary vehicle, which is a very Western presupposition. Right. And that if we understand something well enough, it will lead to change. And again, it's one of those things that my thinking, as much as I appreciate my neocortex, it is profoundly limited and only a part of me. Yeah. And up until the Renaissance, up until the Enlightenment, up until a lot of the Western approach, and there's a lot of things I could say about that, but I would say, we in the West we've placed the mind as the penultimate, and the body is there just kind of to walk it around like a vehicle. Yeah. But the real beauty is in the mind alone, and that is certainly, I think, profoundly missing the point of what Jesus taught and embodied. I would say what most of the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures and our New Testament teach and embody, that it's not the primary. I would say it's a beautiful, elegant part. But if we neglect what I would just say, the heart, if we neglect the body, then I think that we're walking around with just like a third of our potential, and it will never be what the fullness of life that Jesus taught and embodied.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was sitting in rehab, this was, to end of 2019, I did get introduced to a therapy model called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And the one thing that interests me about that was the meditation, the mindful meditation component. It's one of the, and I started doing some meditation. And then when I got out of rehab, met the biggest DBT therapist here in Kansas City, who kind of trained with Marsha Linehan and started Lilac Center here in Kansas City. Got to know her, actually ended up doing some therapy with her and stuff like that. And then I found a mindful meditation teacher who I've been in that group for over 2 years. And then that led me to, and then I just recently maybe 6 months ago, got into a centering prayer group with a guy named Jack Willamy, who used to be on a CAC board, the Richard Center for Action and Contemplation board. I'm in a centering prayer group with him. I consider myself very much a novice, beginner mind in this whole world of mindful meditation. Yeah. And I'm doing a 2-year training with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield as well. I love that. I'm just on the front program. End of that, But it's been interesting to me because I would say that I have a overactive amygdala. Like I've been diagnosed with anxiety disorder at the age of 4, 5, 6 when I think back on it. But I'm so old that we never thought about trying to treat any of that stuff, so you just kind of learn to, and then, I'm the shy, introverted kid. Like I was voted the quietest kid in my senior class. Wow. Of a huge high school. Wow. And, get saved from drugs and feel called to be a pastor, and then start down the education intellectual route, kind of got into the Baptist charismatic world and then the vineyard world. And, I prayed, I did what I would have called meditation, was more like, reflecting on scripture kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
But the mindful meditation, like where I sit and allow things to arise whether they're feelings, whether they're thoughts, whether they're the things in my body that are going on. Yeah. And then actually trying to be non-judgmental, compassionate, open, curious about all. I always try to defeat my negative emotions.
Yeah. Right.
To, like battle them, like Paul's, the flesh and the spirit. Well, I'm going to whip, I've got a lustful thought. I'm going to whip it. Or I've got to
totally, man.
I'm going to beat it up. I'm going to self-discipline these suckers,
Yep. Absolutely.
And then I just had too many things that converged on me that led to such a massive meltdown where I lost literally almost everything except my life, career, marriage, community, literally like everything, to the point. And I was so angry at myself. If there was a God, I was angry at God, angry at some individuals, but it felt I was extraordinarily filled with shame and humiliation because my most embarrassing things had been broadcast all over the world, like publicly, on the Kansas City Star and Christianity Today and Charisma and all these places. And I was just, I was close to suicide probably myself, just not that long ago, 3.5 years ago kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, Richard Rohr, somebody sent me a Falling Upward. And then I started getting into the mindful meditation, and I feel like a beginner in it, but I'm curious, talk to us, help people understand, why is it important to move out of your head and for spirituality, connection with the divine?
Yeah.
Why is it important to move out of your head and into your body? Yeah. Why is that so important?
Well, I mean, first, just kind of anchoring it into this is not a new age woo idea, but even literally when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He of course is quoting Deuteronomy, but he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind and all your soul." And he's a teacher in the wisdom tradition. He just wasn't, grabbing random body parts and thoughts. He just was. His words had meaning. And so, and in the Hebrew understanding, especially that understanding that there was an intelligence, there was a wisdom, not only in your mind, but that you could love God also with your heart, and that you could love God with your soul. And the soul this was the big debate in Jesus's day, but up until that entire point, the soul was not a separate entity. That was really, a lot of that was introduced by Greek thought as the soul was everlasting, and would continue after the death of the body. In most of the Hebrew scriptures, the soul and the body were inseparable. And so this notion of love God with your mind, love God with your heart, and love God with your soul body. And that these were almost like three distinct centers of wisdom and intelligence. And that was very much understood in the early church. It was very much understood, especially as, the gospel went east, not just west. And different emphases of it in the West. And I think this is a lot, like you mentioned earlier, due to Aristotle and Plato, because the gospel didn't just go into tabula rasas culturally, it went to pre-existing notions of the divine. So when it went into Roman and Greek held Western territory, it was primarily interpreted through kind of a Platonic Aristotelian lens. And there's so much on that, and I won't nerd out on that. But I would say in that process, it went very intellectual. As Richard Rohr actually said, that the church in the West, in many ways, has been far more influenced by Plato than by Jesus. Rohr said that, and I think he's right. Yeah. Into this disembodied spirituality. Yeah. So in the West, I think we've elevated the mind. Like we think the mind is this priceless Stradivarius violin, and we think that the heart and the body are like kazoos. Just these kind of. What does your heart say about that? It sounds woo-woo, right? Or what's your gut sense? What's your body? That sounds woo-woo too. Yeah. It wasn't. It wasn't for so many of the centuries of the church. It's just how we've been raised in the Western fish tank of elevating the mind. And when you go back and you begin to understand that there really is a wisdom and brilliance in your heart, and a wisdom and brilliance in your body, and that it's instead of just realizing that your heart is also this priceless Stradivarius violin and your body is also this priceless Stradivarius violin. And when you have all three centers kind of in alignment, I think that's actually the fulfillment of the first and greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with your mind, heart, and soul. But we don't know how to do it. Like people in the West, we don't know how to do it. And when people hear about things like meditation or centering prayer or breath work, which was very common in the first century, by the way. Yeah. And in fact, the desert fathers and mothers taught breath prayer all the time. I mean, it was very common practice in the church. We've neglected it now. But it's kind of like, even if like, for example, culturally, it's acceptable in the vineyard worship experience if you want to raise your hands high when you are moved emotionally. If you go into a conservative Presbyterian church and raise your hands, culturally, you're going to be a weirdo. Like people are going to say you are showing off, you're being too demonstrative. It's impolite, it's distracting. And so each little cultural bubble has their rules. In the West, we have been so raised to be disembodied that I remember when yoga started getting popular in the 80s, like yoga was totally woo-woo. Like yoga was like even in that song, do you like pina coladas? His whole thing is if you're not into yoga, then that's good thing. Like yoga was considered woo-woo. Now it's completely accepted. But understanding that when we talk about embodied spirituality, we're not talking about something new. We really are returning back to the way that Jesus taught, modeled, and embodied. And so much of the early church, I would say, particularly before Constantine and that whole situation in Rome, where it became one of the dominant religions of the Roman Empire under state control. And it became about who's in and who's out. Here's the, do you believe in the Nicene Creed? If you don't, blah, blah, blah. But prior to that, in the early church, it was much more about a spiritual movement. It wasn't about who's in, who's out, and it was much more embodied. So when we talk about, I would say that when we begin things like meditation or breath work, what we're taking is all this brilliant information we've been carrying in our minds, this brilliant dissertations that we can write about our issues, about the divine, about God's love, about Jesus, about all of these pieces, about forgiveness. And it creates space for these brilliant thoughts to actually land into our hearts and into our bodies, where we experience authentic transformation, that we can't think our way. Like we both have learned, you can't think your way. It's in AA, they talk about stinking thinking, right? We can't think our way out of our issues, that it takes embodiment. And so we're simply creating space for these truths that we've studied and know to move from our head to land in our hearts and in our bodies, where they shift from mere intellectual concept to actually embodied experience. And I would say, in terms of my own experience, that there's been many roller coaster rides, even within the wisdom tradition, contemplative world. I mean, I've had highs and lows and burnouts. And I mean, this is not the magic pill, that is going to finally get you there. But I would say, in terms of what leads to real self-awareness, real change, an authentic spirituality that begins to mirror much more of what Jesus taught, and I would say even our New Testament Gospels are articulating, that the most powerful way there is just take a moment to actually step off the hamster wheel of what the Buddhists call monkey mind, of just trying to think your way there. And in the quiet, like, for example, and I'm sorry, I know I'm blathering. This is my last thing, and then I'll give some space. But it's kind of like some of my most favorite intimate moments with partners or with friends are when we're not saying a word. As when, like, for example, you're walking along the beach and the sun is setting and the colors are so gorgeous that it literally stops you in your tracks. And you know that there's this, like Sam said in Mordor, there's a beauty that transcends, that evil can never touch, these transcendent moments. And if someone says a word, if someone tries to speak a word, then they're ruining it. It's like, shut up. This is not a time for words. This is a time just to splash around in the beauty. Or a song that you make everyone in the car be quiet to, because if anyone speaks, it's going to mess up the beauty of the poetry and what the music is doing to your being. Or there's times when you're like eating with friends in a big group and someone makes a joke at the end of the table and the laughter rolls down the table like a warm blanket and washes over you, and you realize you're connected relationally, you're not alone. And it might just be for a moment, but it's these moments where we shift from just mere intellectual understanding to an experience from the inside out. And so when we talk about embodied spirituality, we're talking about genuine experience of the divine from the inside out. As Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within. All of this is already inside of us. We don't have to get it. We don't have to attain it. We don't earn anything. We've already got it. We just learn to rest into it. And a lot of that rest is getting out, quieting the monkey mind, quieting the cacophony in our brains. As C.S. Lewis was talking about, the great enemy of spiritual growth is noise.
Yeah.
And I think that all that intellectual cacophony, 90% of the time, is unhelpful noise. And meditation, centering prayer, breath work helps us shift out of that noise, step off the hamster wheel, and get into a place of quiet where we actually begin to realize, oh my God, I've been nested and resting in the divine this whole time, and I've been trying to earn it, but I'm experiencing this rest of connection. And maybe I can use poetry to express it, but this is an experience that's beyond words. And that to me is an invitation of embodied spirituality. And there's many traditions that have been doing it for centuries. And again, it's part of the early church, but I think we're kind of returning back to the heart of things, to the missing puzzle piece that's fallen out of Christianity in the West, was Cynthia Bourgeault's words.
That's good. Yeah. Cause once I started getting into meditation, I realized how harsh my inner critic voice is and how judgmental I was of my emotions, everything, that my thoughts, my emotions. I would just judge everything. And again, try to battle it, suppress it, beat it up, win over it if it was negative at all.
Yeah.
And, one of the things in meditation that I've, literally sitting with all of that negativity that kind of bubbles up inside me, and then being compassionate and curious, non-judgmental, actually, self-compassion, just that alone has been a really interesting piece, because I always have been compassionate and grace-filled toward other people, but my own, I can cuss myself out, Yeah. And then when I was so full of shame and in my darkest moment, when I just didn't even care if I lived or died, I hated myself, literally, that. I felt so much shame. I just hated myself.
Yeah.
And, one of the things in the AA circles that is kind of an interesting embodiment, it's not breath work, it's not meditation, but when you sit in a circle of really wounded, broken people, and they just get honest, vulnerable, something magical knits human hearts together. And it doesn't
radically
matter, gay, straight, black, white, rich, poor, just human vulnerability. Yeah. It's like that was the only place. Like, if there's a God,
that's church, man. That's what church was meant to be, right?
But then when I was sitting in these circles and would feel the Spirit, because we were into the Spirit moving, come Holy Spirit stuff. But when I'd see that happen in those circles of vulnerability, it was like, that's the Spirit, It was that still is something I do weekly in groups, and
I love that.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about Second Breath, and then what your transition is right now, because you've been the executive director of Second Breath now for a decade or something, maybe?
Well, so as a part of it, I was actually, my journey led me to leave the PCA. I became an Episcopal priest and was in a church, and the church was actually where Second Breath was founded and had been going for about 30 years. But it was primarily like a spiritual school, similar to CAC, similar to Roar's thing, where people would come through, they could take one-offs, or they could do a 3-year intensive program, of the inward spiritual journey and understanding that inner landscape, and then moving to your outward spiritual journey. And I found out about it in 2007 when I was still a PCA pastor. And I was beginning to burn out, though. And that's where I went to that, very skeptical. But it was such a gorgeous and fresh articulation of Christian spirituality that was actually resonant with science and resonant with my heart. And when I say fresh, I don't mean new. I mean, a lot of what they were teaching was just so much of what had been taught, especially by the desert fathers and mothers in the early church, and so much of this tradition. And so it was a profound game changer. And it was the first place, all I knew at that point, the reason I went, I was burning out. I learned about just some meditation, but I knew nothing about it. So I went and I got this chair and I put it in my den, And I would get up in the morning and I'm just saying, okay, I don't know anything about meditation. I don't know anything about centering prayer, but all I'm going to do is sit here. And I said, God, you know that I don't know jack shit. Clearly what I'm doing is not working out. And so I'm not going to read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. I'm not going to do my adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. I'm not going to go through a prayer journal. I'm just going to sit here and literally do nothing. And for at least a half hour every morning. I was desperate at this point, because I was burned out. And so, and I said, it's going to be like sitting at the beach. I just need your sunshine to wash over me and heal me. And my job is to do nothing. And I promise to do nothing. And so I would sit down, and I'm 100% sure I've got ADD, but like you, man, this is before we were diagnosed with this thing. Back in the 70s, they just said you're a hyper kid, and that's what it is. So, I was probably about 2 minutes into my very first time sitting in the chair, and it was torture, man. Like I was so bored. I was anxious. All I wanted to do was get on my phone, my smartphone, and start surfing. All I wanted to do is turn on the TV, but desperation is a powerful motivator. So I would just sit there day after day. And initially it was excruciating, but after a few weeks and months of this, like things really started shifting. Like I started looking forward to it. It was like this little oasis. It was like this little oasis in my crazy day. And soon the only time of day that I liked, actually, because I was still pastoring the PCA church at the time and it was exhausting, the only time that I liked was sitting in my chair. And so I remember I said, I was praying to God. I was like, all right, God, how can I make chair time all day long? Like, how can I can't just sit in my chair. I got work to do. So, but how can chair time and this quiet resting, learning to actually rest in your presence? Because I started to experience a sense of deep inner peace and rest. I started experiencing this, that God was not far off, off in the third heaven, but that I'm immersed in divine presence, that God really is closer than my thoughts and prayers. That shifted from things I'd preach about to actual experience of it. And it came from doing nothing. It came from literally doing nothing. And so I asked, I need chair time to be more than, just chair time. I need it to be all day long. And then right around that time, someone told me about Second Breath. It was then called Servant Leadership School, but it was Second Breath. And so I went to this class. And again, the only spiritual practice, quote unquote, I had knew in the contemplative tradition was just sitting on my ass in my chair. They gave me this whole toolbox full of all these spiritual practices, like you could incorporate them into all your whole day. Like when you're sitting in a meeting, when you're driving in your car, when you're stuck at a red light, before you go to bed, it was when you're walking through the woods. It was kind of easy to do. It wasn't like this, go sell everything you have and live in a cell in the mountains of the Himalayas. It was like made for people in real life, right? In what we're doing. And it was such a profound game changer experientially for me of what it meant. Again, it was that shift from mere intellectual. And again, this is Richard Rohr's definition of a mystic. A mystic is not some woo-woo person living in a cement cell. But he said, simply put, a mystic is someone who has shifted from mere intellectual systems of belief to actual inner experience. That's it. From mere intellectual systems of belief to actual inner experience. That's a mystic. And so that's the invitation, how we begin to make this shift. And so that's what I feel like Second Breath was teaching me. And it was a vast variety. There were evangelicals, there were atheists, there was mainly, progressives and liberals, like we were all there. And it wasn't trying to teach us to some system of doctrine of, it didn't say, do you literally believe in an Adam and Eve? It was just an invitation to understand Jesus as not just Savior, but also a wisdom teacher, that it wasn't just that he died on the cross, but he was teaching for years to teach us what it meant to live fully and freely. And so it was really diving into this teaching and life of Jesus to understand how to embody fullness of life now, not just waiting to die so we can go to heaven, and to really live fully now. And so these spiritual practices were such a game changer in my life that I quit the PCA church, promised to never work in a church again, started a nonprofit that was focused on spiritual direction and retreats, ended up getting pulled into the very church against my will initially that was host of the Servant Leadership Second Breath. And I ended up becoming not only working full-time in the church as an Episcopal priest, but then eventually as the director of Second Breath. And Second Breath, again, their heart is inviting people to an embodied spirituality. It is full of spiritual practices. In fact, I feel so great to promote them now because I'm no longer I'm still a part-time advisor and mentor. But there's an app with hundreds of spiritual practices designed specifically to get you in touch with the wisdom of the mind, the wisdom of the heart, and the wisdom of the body. And it's a real blend of rich Christian spirituality in our tradition, in our broad Christian tradition, and also modern research on the impact of meditation and neuroscience and the impact on the hard science stuff, stuff out of Harvard and Yale and Oxford. And so it really is just beautifully designed practices that are so accessible. Some are 3 minutes. You can do as long as 20 minutes, whatever floats your boat. But we find that when people begin, even if they just start with like 3 minutes a day, like even if they just choose to try to be quiet and rest and be still for 3 minutes a day, we know statistically, in terms of all the years we've been teaching this, anyone that has been putting these things in practice in their life has experienced change, has experienced transformation. It's just how we're made. It's like, to me, it's that like the Holy Spirit's just waiting at our elbow and waiting for the door to crack, waiting for us to open up. And most of our lives are so filled with noise, there's no space. But when we create even a little bit of space, it's amazing what happens, how the coins begin to drop, how we begin to make that shift from mere intellectual systems of belief to actual inner experience. So that's what Second Breath's passionate about. They're now in over 110 countries, in terms of their material being used. There's an online school take you through the inward journey and what it means to begin to dive deep inwardly. But again, and I love that it's not convincing anyone of doctrine. This isn't about a theological debate. This is talking about this invitation of the way Jesus taught and embodied to live fully and freely now. And so that's what I love about it. I mean, it's a total game changer for me. Yeah. And I can't be more proud of that group and amazing staff and what they've done and continue to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. In the Calvin tradition, you've got that harsh,
total depravity.
Yeah. And so, people tend to not trust their heart, their body, their emotions, right? If you come out of that system. And then what's interesting too, I've noticed, even though the 12-step world is a higher power and it's not like nobody's arguing doctrine there, right?
Right.
But a lot of people who have gone through addiction have kind of lost confidence in their own self, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And have had to kind of trust a program or people around them or community to help restore sort of that sense of internal trust. Like I really lost confidence in myself. And I was never a huge, dirty rotten, and I didn't pound on that one, like, right. We're all broken in some way, but God loves us kind of thing. But yeah, I've noticed that, I read, when I was reading Rohr's footnotes, I found Matthew Fox's Original Blessing. I don't know if
I've read that.
That was really beautiful to me. I thought, wow. I love the way he kind of put that and live out of, start at Genesis 1-2, not Genesis 3. And
dude, goosebumps. What you're saying is so important. I mean, Fred, I mean, honestly, what you're saying, like if like that one crux of, and I honestly think one of the most traumatic and most dangerous aspects of a lot of evangelical teaching in the West is to convince you not to trust yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, literally. And once we do that and we offload our sense of identity and our sense of reality to an external framework, which of course was constructed, in the PCA or Calvinistic world, in the Presbyterian Church, it was this, reform movement that went up through the angry Scottish Isles and then down to the Southern colonies. And you just realize that was the biggest aha moment for me, is that I have been taught not to trust my heart. And they take that, verse out of the Hebrew scriptures completely out of context of, the heart is, wicked above all things. And they say, they use that to make their case, and they teach you, I mean, honestly, to heal from that harmful trauma and begin to actually know that if the kingdom of God is within, and that you can actually trust your heart. It doesn't mean that you're not a part of community, and that if people are coming and saying, look, you're way off base here, then you need to be open to that. But if you're going to actually experience God from the inside out, that was, when we talk about epistemology, how do we know what truth is? What is our criteria for evaluating what is true? my epistemological perspective, I outsourced mine to this Reformed framework.
Mhm.
And it did not lead me to fullness of life. It did not lead me to have a life, my inner landscape defined by the fruit of the Spirit. It made me judgmental. It made me anxious. It made me fearful, while saying all the right things of grace and love and compassion and forgiveness. And it wasn't until I actually made that shift, and it came through, my first spiritual director was a Franciscan friar. And then it came through reading Roar and getting, starting meditation, when I actually started to trust my heart. And I found that when I actually started to trust my heart, and it was a massive shift, like people were like, how did you go from like this conservative Presbyterian to, someone that would even be open to being this liberal, wacky Episcopal priest? That it was a shift that occurred when I actually started trusting my heart. And I would say when I started doing that, that's when I started actually experiencing love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, like actually from the inside out. And it was congruent. And my heart actually felt congruent with the love of Jesus instead of this external fear-based framework. But it took that awakening to actually trust our own hearts. I think that's so damn important.
Yeah, I felt like my whole guidance system fell apart when my darkness, 3.5 years ago. And then I found that original blessing. Another book that really helped me a lot was Parker Palmer's Let Your Life Speak.
Oh, baby. That was required reading at second breath.
Oh my, I needed that guidance that he has in that book, and that, and learning how to accept my darkness. Cause I had a lot, I was a fallen evangelical megachurch pastor, so like, well, how do I embrace this as a part of who I am? Like, I just wanted to run and hide and die,
Yes.
Yeah. So,
and then look, and then, this is, and same thing. I've gone through, so many iterations and carrying so much shame, and for years, trying to fight the darkness. And fighting that inner darkness is like watching my kids when they were little try to fight the waves at the beach. The wave is going to win. You can punch and kick, but you're losing, my man. The wave is coming in. And approaching that inner darkness combatively or in a controlling manner versus with curiosity and compassion, which ironically is the way that they become, light.
You begin to integrate who you really are and heal from it, right? Versus,
that's everything.
Well, we could, I'm still on that journey, Greg.
Yeah, me too, man. Like beginner's mind all throughout.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so cool, man. I love just hearing you talk about your work and your journey. It really, really resonated with me. So tell us what's going on now. If people, if people are interested in this talk, how can they find you? I found you on Facebook. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I've been in ministry, at 17, I knew that I wanted to go into ministry. So when I graduated college, moved to Africa, and then since then, now I'm 51, I've been in full-time ministry since then. So interestingly, one of the things that I've been doing on the side, or just as a part of just to friends mainly, but I've been doing some executive coaching. I would meet with these CEOs and bank VPs and kind of create space for their spiritual journey. Honestly, it was not overtly, but it was just, again, folding these practices into life. And I could go into a work setting that was secular in nature and teach these practices. I don't need them to convert to do it. But what I found was when I'd go into these businesses, like the change that would occur, like real life, not just preaching and hoping, but like seeing people put practices into place, grow and being vulnerable and authentic and building trust in these businesses and teams. Like these lives and organizations were transformed. Like talk about real lives being changed. People going from, gossip and bigotry and anger to actually trust and vulnerability and enjoying work and living out of their hearts. So I was just like, it was so fascinating. Like I've been in the church world for 28 years. And it was so interesting for me to actually bring so much of what I've learned in spiritual practice to the corporate world and then watch the impact. And I'm not trying to, it's apples and oranges because I've been around spiritual transformation in churches, but I would say the data points of actual transformation and change in the corporate environment that I've been able to work with are so much clearer than what happens in the church world that I've worked in for 28 years. And so one of the things that I've just kind of been drawn to recently is meeting with corporations as a consultant to pretty much bring in relational vitality, culture vitality, and organizational health. And the irony is that so much of it I'm using all that I've learned in 28 years as a pastor, missionary, executive director in these environments. And so for me, it's like I never would have thought that that's what I've been drawn to. But in terms of what feels like making real impact that is measurable in these places. So currently that's what I'm drawn. And I'm an entrepreneur. So I tend to be, I know that my executive coach said to me the other day, just you want these companies to hire you, just tell them you're not going to be there for more than 2 years. And so I've just learned that about me. So this is where I'm kind of drawn right now. And I'm passionate about this consulting, and I'm still working with Second Breath in terms of a mentor and consultant as well. Okay. But so that's kind of where I am. It's very exciting for me. It's and practical too.
Awesome, man. Well, we've run out of time. I need to let you get to your appointment, but it's Greg Farrand, Farrand, Greg Farrand.
Yeah.
Your Facebook page is out there. Second Breath is you're still a consultant there. They have a great website, and check that
app. Check out the app, man. Yeah, the app is sick. The app is fantastic.
Yeah. And that can get you into a lot of embodied spiritual practices. So great stuff, Greg. Thank you for
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks for
and thank you for sharing, man. I know. Thanks for. I mean, obviously, one massive fruit of all that you've been through is just you lead out of such vulnerability and presence. It's really, it feels so safe and just enjoyable. Different podcasts that I've been on, you never quite know. And I can just say clearly, I think because of your journey and what you've been through, you share, invite, ask questions out of such a kind, vulnerable, humble, authentic space. So this has really been a pleasure, man. So thanks for just letting me be a part of your world.
Maybe we'll bump into each other at the Wild Goose Festival this year.
Yeah, right on, man. Right on. Talk about, that's another thin space right there.
I'll text you and see if we can connect or something. So, well, cool, man. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and we will see you next time. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.